Hey, Tim, imagine this. Imagine you're about to build your dream home. You spec it out with your wife. You've got the overall design sketched out. You add a few touches like vaulted ceilings and huge beams. You've got solid wood doors. The exterior doors are built for security and for beauty, and they're actually imported. The handcrafted cabinets are just beautiful. You've got this wonderful granite tops. The entranceway has been featured in House Beautiful magazine. The smart home elaboration automation is absolutely state of the art. Exciting. Are you excited about that, Tim?
Oh, yes, I am. I can't wait.
Well, what if I told you this? You do your research, and as you begin to look at the home building industry, here's what you find out. More than 40% of home builder projects go over budget. Can you imagine the home builder coming in and saying, well, I estimate that your house is going to be 500,000, but when you're at the bank, why don't you ask for 750 just in case? And did you know that half of new homes are not ready on the date that you've already scheduled to move in? How about this? The 30% don't include everything you've contracted for. And the worst of all is that 1 in 7 homes never actually get finished.
Oh,
It's
wow.
all by the wayside. Now, let me ask you this, Tim. Would you build that home?
Oh boy. I've been in similar situations actually, and I would say no.
I would say no too. Unfortunately, my wife and I have actually built several homes from scratch. Well, three homes from scratch, and we've done some remodeling projects as well. And I can tell you honestly that the home building industry does not have that reputation, but the industry that you and I are in does.
Yep.
And those numbers are rough numbers. I rounded them up. Are rough numbers from a 2017 study that was conducted actually on behalf of the Project Management Institute. So with that in mind, you and I are longtime project managers. We've seen the good, we've seen the bad, we've seen some pretty ugly. So with that in mind, having looked at those kinds of statistics, why don't we spend some time this hour talking about what makes for project success, what makes for project failure. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
So let's give us a couple of minutes of your background, and then we'll get into the conversation.
So, quick background. I come from an undergraduate of IT in business and graduate degree of business, and a gentleman who thought that since he knew everything about databases in business, could be incredibly successful in consulting and projects and project management. And boy, was I wrong. It took me 3 to 5 years to actually get an understanding of even what project success was, even though I had people around me who'd been doing this for 20 years. And I was in consulting for 7.5 or 8 years before I basically had to make my own way in the world. And I became an entrepreneur. One thing you don't know about me, Merv, for about 2 years, I was part owner in a corporation that upgraded cell towers around the country. So some telecommunications and construction project management in that. And that was exciting because it was my own money I was playing with, not just funny money. And so I learned the ropes as well as learned human behavior. So that's my background. What about you? Quick 2 minute.
Well, interestingly enough, I went through computer science. I went through an honors degree in computer science at my university, and graduated from there, went straight into IT development for a government department. 3 years later, I joined a consulting group, and I've been consulting ever since for the last 40 years. The last 16, in fact, I've been consulting under my own firm's name. During that time, I've worked on projects anywhere from $1 million to 400 and some $1 million. So I've seen many of the types of project successes and project challenges that we're going to be talking about today. Currently, I have spent the last 25, 30 years in 20 different states, and I've also worked in 2 provinces in Canada. So at my last, you'll like this, at my last calculation, I have about 4 million airline miles under my belt. So We have not paid for a vacation from an airline perspective in years.
Ouch.
But let's get on to the topic, Tim. Let me ask you this. What do you consider is a project failure from an IT perspective?
Boy, if I talk to non-project managers, if I talk to my students as an introduction to PM, I say a project failure is where the deliverable does not meet its objective. Okay, we basically create something or we don't, but we don't answer and we don't hit why we created it. There's always a reason you set aside money and time to do something, and there's always a reason you put a head count behind that. And that's what a project manager is. It's an investment, and companies don't make investments, and they actually have a reason to do it. And so when you don't hit that, that's when it's failure. Now, how about you? How do you define this?
Well, if I go with the traditional scientific literature approach to it, I might say, well, it's a failure in scope or timeline and or quality and or cost or budget. And those are fairly easy to say, that when I deliver this project, if I'm over time or over budget or that sort of thing, that it's considered a failure. But then I really got thinking about it. In fact, I wrote a blog post recently. Is that really true? Are there conditions where, the science may say the project has failed, but has it in fact failed? So the traditional sense would be those four qualities, but I'm not sure. I think there's a huge number of caveats within that.
I tend to agree with you. One of my mentors back in 2000, 2001 said that there are no project failures, only degrees of success. And you can either think of this as spinning, or you can think of it as we didn't hit the mark, but what if the mark moved?
Yeah.
And what do we do? Does that mean failure because the mark moved? This is one thing we have to figure out. Now, so you're pulling from tradition, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In that case, yeah.
Yeah, and for me, it was actually pulling through project management, non-project management literature, and it's not just projects. It's work in general. It's operations, business, and projects and project management. You never do anything without having a very good reason to do it. So it's interesting how not just we have these differences, but how we came about to them.
Well, and I mentioned that I went with the traditional approach because those are obvious, but I would say that there are caveats. And I'll give you one example. One project that I was on, I won't name the client or the situation, but we had been working hard as a combined client IT team, but things got a little out of hand, as they traditionally do. There were some scope changes. There were some issues along the way that we had to deal with. As project managers, we were flexible enough to deal with them. But what ended up happening was we delivered late, and we did go over budget, which fortunately for on the IT side, the client absorbed because they felt that their scope changes caused the overage. Now, here's the thing. From a traditional approach, that may be considered a project failure. We delivered late, we delivered over budget, but here's what happened. When we rolled it out to the field, there was over 10,000 end users. You should have heard the accolades coming back. This is so much better than what we ever had before. This was worth waiting for. This was incredible. I love this. I can service my clients now in half the time. So I ask you, was it a project failure or perhaps a project management failure? And I think there's a little difference there.
Yeah, and we'll explore that. Let me give you one more example that is interesting. So an internal project, and the idea was to create a customer relations management system, a CRM system, and they reorged. And all of a sudden, the organization that we're building for no longer needed a CRM system, so they closed it down. Now,
Hmm.
does that mean project failure too? And this
Well,
is a stumper, you know, and I always ask my students, just because you close a project early and you don't spend all the money and the objective is gone, can you call that a project failure?
and this is where, when I was looking at the PMI numbers that I kind of played with up front, in the front of our thing, and I've recently looked at some of the Standish Group numbers, I need to really dig into where those come from, because I'm not sure if the literature would count that a project failure. Personally, I would not. I have had a very similar situation. Our team had won a wonderful project, a great project, but the client had forced is a hard word, but the client had put in their technical requirements certain technology that we had to use when we bid the state-of-the-art system for them. What we found after we got into it was that the equipment, the processor that they were using, was set up, was defined or developed specifically for quick transaction processing. Think of an airline reservation system, where you got those quick little transactions. Well, the project that we were defining was process intensive, data intensive. We could run through the entire database and it would take the entire night's batch cycle to do so before we turned it on in the morning. We found out that the processor, which was developed for quick transactions, was not made for the kind of system we were building for. Now you can point all kinds of fault fingers at that, but the client said, you know what? We blew it. We're stopping the project. Again, was that a failure? Perhaps up front, but certainly not from the client's perspective in not sending good money after bad. Now, I'll tell you, from an IT perspective, where some of our money is made on the change orders that come after, yeah, it was perhaps a failure on our part for us, but no, from a client perspective, it was absolutely the right thing to do.
And if you look at traditional literature, you have to start off with some fundamental assumptions. The dichotomy of control. There are some things we can control and there are things we cannot control.
Right.
And I think this is where we're going to hit our heads against for the rest of the time today. Do we have control over things or not? And can we claim success over things we can't control? And can we claim failure over things we can't control either? That's the whole thing. And the intent and what I like to actually talk about is the things we can control, because again, that's where I think that, again, this is a feeling. I haven't thought this through, but I think we can only define success and control, success and failure over the things we have direct control.
I probably haven't thought of this much either, but thinking back over my career now, I want to give you kind of an establishment of where I come from. I come from the industry that bids fixed price.
Yes.
Now, think about bidding a fixed price for a $400 million job. If you're off by 10%, that's a $40 million hit to the
Yeah, and fixed prices, we know exactly every step of the way, and the client does not have to interact with the workers.
So from that perspective, we have to, again, coming from that industry means I have to come from a place of control. Now, I will differ from you a little bit, because we insisted when we wrote our proposals, we insisted that the client did give us a team and that they had some responsibility for their part. For example, we couldn't define the requirements on their behalf. They had to be there. We could not do their user acceptance testing. They had to be there. Those sorts of things. So we demanded that they have their roles and responsibilities, which added even some more friction, because when there's a scope issue, the things you can or cannot control, whose scope issue is it? Is it the client's demand, or is it the project team's failure? So there you have it. Can you control everything? or can you not? In my world, we had to. We absolutely had to.
Right, right, right. And so we have to control. So I dabbled in that, and that's telecommunications as well. I worked mostly under cost and fixed and cost and time and materials contracts as a consultant. But when I worked directly in telecommunications, all of a sudden it was fixed contracts. And again, you bid low, and you work to build up the profit through the work orders. That's just the nature and the culture, which of course is a little bit toxic, but that's just the nature of the industry.
It is.
At the same time, um, there's an obvious understanding that you cannot control everything, weather, politics, the change in federal requirements with the FCC regulations around the cell towers, and we had horrible times working on that, and so we had to actually, change the scope not only with a physical understanding, but a conceptual understanding. Based on this, these are things that are outside of our control, and we have to put that under acts of God or acts of nature, or we cannot continue.
Yeah.
We're not the masters of time and space.
Right. No, I had any number of situations like that as well. A lot of them came from federal mandates. Think of I did a lot of work in the human services industry, or in that government kind of space. And what was interesting is when one party was in power, they would try to cut, or they would try to put regulation in that would force, let's say, folks to work rather than get public assistance as much as possible. The other party would come into power, and the opposite were true. And so if I just wanted to kind of vibrate between the two, I could have a career just changing the systems back and forth from that perspective. So the nice thing in those situations, though, was that our client also recognized that in those kinds of cases, they were also at the mercy of whoever was in, I'll say, in power at the time. And so we would always build in, with, by the way, the federal government's permission, a contingency, whether that be 10% or 20% or 30%, so that no one felt bad about scope issues if somewhere in the middle of your project, the legislature changed.
So just to get this clear,
Yes.
The rule of thumb was to put 10% on the back of the schedule and budget just to protect. Was that basically what was expected by the client in these large projects?
It was pretty much expected, sometimes more, because you remember the time when President Obama came in and they had passed the legislation called Obamacare.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on one project, we were right in the middle of that. And so anticipating that would be a major change, we worked with the client to set aside far more than just 10%. So again, knowing kind of the environment, you control what you can control, and what you can't control, you come to an understanding with your client that there needs to be contingency to allow that control to take place.
Yeah, and again, working inside the sausage factory of power and politics in corporations, there's always something else called management reserve, where they're not protecting the project itself, they're protecting the business and the corporation. So if you're a little loose and free with that 10% inside the project, you always have a fallback.
Well, we did and we didn't, because we always, when we were bidding, we knew we had competition. So if you fattened the back end with a lot of management reserve and your competitor didn't, chances are you wouldn't win the job.
Wow.
And so then that became the strategy. How much do I put in? How much do I not put in? So basically back to the, can I control this? back to the whole idea that once you got the project started and you developed your commingled team of IT and client staff, you worked very tightly with those staff to keep things on schedule and to keep things as tight as you could, with, you know, without rubbing people the wrong way and always saying no, no, no. But we had to manage those very carefully and very closely so that we wouldn't burn through the reserves.
So here's a question. You and I both understand and live and profess with the focus on it's all about the people and all about the relationships.
Yeah.
Is controlling and minimizing project failure the technical components? Is it managing schedule, budget, costs, and risk? Or is it more managing the expectation of people, setting up a successful work environment, setting up a culture such that people really want to actually hit a target instead of just get their work done?
I have a one-word answer for that. Yes. All of that.
It's all of the above.
What's been your experience in those areas?
It's all about the people. You can have the greatest plan in the world, but if people are not behind you, they're not behind the plan.
Yeah.
You can have the greatest people in the world, but even when you do everything right, it can still fail.
Yeah.
So the best you can do is basically hit a middle ground and work from the middle and expect that it's just going to take effort to catch these things as early as possible and influence the events, not change them, but influence the environment around the events such that you can actually, control damage and recover quickly and effectively.
Yeah. And, the project manager, and maybe a lot of project managers, especially when they're fairly early in their career, don't understand this, but a project manager does have a fair amount of techniques or strategies at his or her disposition. I can think of one situation where we had won a project and our counterpart on the project management side had wanted one of our competitors to win. She was not liking the fact that we won. So her first words upon signing the contract were, "My job is to make sure that you don't make any money." Now you get into a situation like that where we were a for-profit enterprise. They were the client expecting to get something based on the bid that we had put in and the RFP that they had put out. But suddenly on day one, you have this clash of the titans where two project managers have two almost diverting strategies or goals. The project manager from our side had the goal of delivering a project and making money. On her side, she stated that she wanted to deliver the project but we shouldn't make any money. So again, in those situations, rather than let that go, our project manager should have, he did not, but he should have gone to our management, who could then deal with her management and get it all worked out early. But those are the kinds of things that project managers have to understand, that there are strategies that are not in the books. They are not in the process.
I know the day in the conversation, I had that understanding. Do you remember when you started gradually experiencing this knowledge?
I don't know that I could pinpoint a very particular situation. I can pinpoint a mentoring situation where a mentor came onto a project for 18 months to mentor me through it. And then I watched him very closely. And every day after 5 o'clock, we got together and talked about the events of the day so that he could walk me through things. That might have been my closest 18-month pinpoint of what was it.
And that basically is what it's about. I had a mentor. My manager was not even a project manager, but he was a second line manager. He managed managers. And he said, "Tim, you are the crucible. You're going to protect the team." And the team says, we have to do work this way, this way, this way, this
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And he said, Tim, you're going to have to listen to and set expectations with executives. And they're going to say, but it has to be this way, this way, this way, this way, this way. And you're in the middle.
Yeah.
It's pressure and heat. And if you can maintain that and monitor it, that's where diamonds are made. And
Interesting.
boom, all of a sudden I said, through heat and frustration and through differences of opinion, that's where innovation comes from. That was the day in the moment that all of a sudden it clicked for me. It's not the fact that I make decisions, and the education material says this all the time. It's not the fact that I make decisions that make a project successful. I create that optimum heat and pressure so that people with different opinions can come together and create unique and new ideas. And that has served me well, both in crises as well as in just day-to-day project work.
Which kind of leads to a topic that we'll come up with in a few weeks from now, and that's healthy conflict. That heat and that pressure.
Yes.
Conflict, but healthy conflict is good conflict.
That's right.
Similar to what you said, I had a mentor that told me, and this is probably well known through the industry. I was young, I did not know this, but for a project manager to hesitate and sit there and hum and haw, which way should I go? And to sit on a decision not being made is essentially making a decision.
Right.
Until you say, I'll go this way or I'll go this way, you haven't made a decision. And therefore, the forces of just complacency basically take over.
Yeah, that's one of our business prophets, Geddy Lee, right?
Yeah.
If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Yep. You've made it.
Exactly. And the problem is, it's not necessarily hesitation, but it's the sitting on the choice long enough that momentum and gravity will make the choice for you.
Yeah.
And that's where things go south. We come back to that sense of control. And control is not necessarily a heavy master hand that's tight. You also have that finesse of balancing a surfboard. And if you hesitate in balancing a surfboard, all of a sudden it's surfing you. And that's the problem we get when we have these strange positions and points in our projects. They tend to surf us. And that's where project failure can insert itself very easily.
Very easily, yes. You just reminded me of my time in Hawaii when weekends I was out boogie boarding, me a 200-pound, 6-foot guy trying to stay on that boogie board. And I've got these 9-year-old kids starting in and actually under my boogie board and stuff. So yeah, there was many times that I took a tumble that I shouldn't have because I was not paying attention, not focusing. I was balancing incorrectly and ended up with some mouths full of salt water and sand several times.
And you have to do that a few times before you really understand and respect that balance. Yeah. This is not something that we can memorize and learn and get right. This is something we need to burn our hands and touch the stove a few times before we really start being good at this part.
Well, and I'll tell you, and even when I felt I was being good at this part, that's when fate would slap me with something I'd never seen before. So, and I think what you're saying is correct. I think what happens is you develop that almost that muscle memory, that the ability to be flexible and react in a situation with a good decision. Doesn't have to be the best decision, doesn't have to be necessarily the absolutely correct decision, but a decision. In fact, I had a boss tell me that if 60% of your decisions are right, then you're well ahead of the game.
Right. And that's Peter Drucker.
I didn't realize that. That's good.
Yeah. Peter said, a third of your decisions are going to be good. A third of the decisions are going to be bad, and a third of the decisions, you doesn't matter what way you went, they're gonna end up inconsequential. And so making the decision and knowing when and how to make the decisions are the critical components. Yeah, and again, we're coming up with topics that are wonderful that we really need to talk about. This is one of the areas that I explored. I was thinking about having a dissertation built on just how people make decisions and why people make decisions and good decision making. It was the CEOs that I was watching and the CXOs as I was going through all these corporations. These guys had a natural knack at it, and I asked a few of them, the ones I could approach. I asked, how did you get good at decision making? And they said, I'm good at decision making, first of all. And second of all, they'd mostly say, well, you make enough decisions, you get a sense for it. But I don't want that. I don't want a sense for it.
Right.
I want instructions to tell me how to do it.
But thinking about this, if I were a young project manager listening to Tim and Merv right now, and they're saying you have to be able to make a decision, what advice might we give to a first or second time project manager when it comes to a fairly critical decision? Should he or she make that decision on their own, or should he or she perhaps bounce it off someone before they make the decision? What do you think?
Oh, trusted advisors, trusted advisors, trusted advisors.
I don't,
Have a crew, have a tribe, have somebody who's a crusty old sailor who's done this 1,000 times. And then they'll say, why are you bothering me with this? And then be so insistent that they actually give you an answer and walk carefully through this, how they come about doing it.
yeah.
This is not something you learn through book learning.
No, and I just didn't want anybody listening to us who's fairly young say, oh, I'm going to make that decision Monday morning and we're going to go forward. And it could be a decision born from lack of experience that might not be helpful.
Well, and not only that, but this goes back to human behavior. One of the quickest things we can do is make a decision. That's because the decision-making mechanism is in our survival part of our brain. It's in the emotional part of the brain. So it's been making more decisions and better decisions than this front thing.
Yeah.
Now, the front part of our brain is much younger. And the problem is the emotional part of the brain makes a decision, and usually the only thing that the front part of the brain is doing is justifying it. And what we need to do is relearn. And this is what Aristotle and Plato and Seneca and Epictetus and all those guys were talking about. How do you pump the brakes in an appropriate amount of time at the right time so you can sit back, gather the data, gather the experts, and validate? The validation does not make the decision. Okay, it's the fight or flight, it's the emotions that make the decision. Validation ensures a higher probability of making a better decision.
That's true.
That's where you and I can come in and help these people who are younger. How do I pump the brakes and not make a decision just pure emotions?
Well, and on that topic as well, having spent pretty much my entire career consulting, after I got out of the pure development ranks and began to manage projects and then consult to projects, I learned very quickly that there's two words that came in handy to every consultant. And this is a consulting joke, but I use them to my benefit. Those two words are, it depends. And I would use that because let's say the client came to me and was really stuck and wanted me to make the decision on their behalf. Well, I was not equipped, nor was my liability insurance protective enough of my ability to help have that decision made on their behalf. So by using those two words, it depends, I could offer two alternatives. And here's what I found almost every time, whether it was my client or whether it was a person on my project, the answer was probably already within them. They just needed someone to be able to clarify it for them. And those two words, it depends, really, really helped set them straight.
They need two things. They know what the answer is, and they're afraid to face it.
There you go.
Number one, they need validation. Number two, they need permission.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are in these critical business decisions. They need permission. Let me give you a situation where we did not use it depends. And I was in with a data architect and two construction specialists on data centers. And we were talking about helping three organizations become one. And we were talking to one of the directors. And this is consulting reality, everyone. The guy was talking about architecture and combination of architecture. And then all of a sudden he stopped, and you could just see him just sink in his chair. And he said, "That's not the real problem I'm trying to solve." Well, the problem he was trying to solve was two of his friends were just fired. And he couldn't go through the process of even thinking about this. He had to think about taking over their jobs, and he couldn't grieve. He couldn't be emotional about it. He had to be mechanical and then get this out of the way so he could take time off. And so we weren't even solving the problem that we were brought in to fix. You know, a lot of the problems we have sound like they're projects that we can actually do something about, but that depends actually opens up the conversation to where you can actually explore and find out, I can't help you with that one. But at the same time, we can actually give you an architectural solution that gives you time and to stabilize and think about what you want to do.
Well, and kind of furthering that along, the other thing that I found was, yes, sometimes often the answer was within them, but often if it was not, they just needed someone to kind of coach it out of them. And then, you know, how proud they were of themselves when they themselves came up with the answer. Now, did I earn my money that day just by helping them to come to that answer? Absolutely. They paid well for that advice, and it was well worth what it was that they paid for. But from that perspective, then we could carry on, and they were much happier with their decision as opposed to having a decision forced upon them or pushed upon them or suggested to them. So,
and let's go even further. That I don't want to belabor this topic, but it's so important. We know about constraints, and we know about triple constraints, right? I want it fast, I want it cheap, and I want all the bells and whistles, and please choose two, right? That's a dilemma. And the difference between an issue and a dilemma is an issue can be resolved, but a dilemma cannot. And you can exist with dilemmas as long as you can maintain the balance.
that's true.
And sometimes with the clarification and the understanding, this is where your conversation of it depends actually takes on its full context, you know, and this level of problem solving is something that we need to have mentors and trusted advisors around.
And maybe that is one of the top qualifications or characteristics or skills of a project manager. That is problem solving.
Yes, it's and knowing when.
And knowing
Just solving a problem is not going is going to be the right thing to do, or solving a problem is the wrong thing to do.
I was Exactly. I was often fond of saying, you know, we as project managers, we earn a nice living doing what we love. But if there were no problems, we wouldn't have jobs. So we as project managers should relish the fact that there are problems on projects. And by solving those problems, we turn a project that potentially could fail into one that will succeed. So,
Right.
you know, back to the whole failure success thing, a project manager, you know, we way back when you asked the question, can we lead, can we say that we have control? And I think in many ways we can. I think in many
Yeah.
ways.
And again, I would ask you to a great or I don't want to beg the answer, okay? But um, is success and failure a perception? Is it a spin?
Well, if I'm the accountant on the project, it is not a perception. If you have doubled my budget and I have to take it from another project, that's no longer a perception. But if I'm the end user that, you know, I'm not aware of the timelines necessarily. Well, I was promised this in March and I got it in September, but I got a wonderful project or a wonderful system that I can now use. To me, there's that perception is all reality in terms of it's a success. So I think it depends on who you are. If you're the IT provider who delivered late and the loss of profitability or the over budget came out of your pocket, the client may be delighted and feel it's a huge success. You as the IT provider who lost profitability think it may be a failure. So there's all of these combinations of what is success, what is failure, and who is it success and failure for.
Yep. The general contractor of my first major data center was up in Pacific Northwest, just south of Seattle. And he said, preparing the culture for a major transition can take anywhere from 9 months to up to 3 years. Because like you said, you know, measuring success has to be part of the communications, and you have to gain consensus, especially when the board of directors are setting aside that funding to make something happen. Everybody has to be in line from top down. And so doing this and working with these type of decisions and changes, you have to get ahead of them and you have to plan for them. It's not that you're predicting failure, it's that you're actually predicting the risk and protecting the work from these things that are going to happen. Like you said, an accountant is angry and yet a CIO is ecstatic, and then a third of the IT is fired. You know, how do you actually measure success in that environment?
Right.
You don't. You create a culture, and the culture embraces the change.
Exactly. I'll tell you this is one of my favorite things that I did towards the latter part of my career was I began to work more with the client organizations rather than the IT side of the system development, system implementation equation. And in doing so, I had I'll say privilege of watching the sausage being made.
Right.
Meaning that I actually got to write the RFP on behalf of my client. And then what I'm getting to, Tim, is your comments about the culture. So when we let the RFP process became a lengthy, because these RFPs were anywhere from, they could be several hundred to 1,000 pages long just to be able to respond to those RFPs. So therefore, the procurement process to have the competitors bid on these things was fairly lengthy. So what do I, as the consultant, do between the time that the RFP is let and the time that we select the winning IT provider? That could be a gap of 8 or 9 months. Well, in the situations that I had, a couple of these very large situations, going back to what you're talking to, I went to the the CIO equivalent or the actually the CEO equivalent, and said, look, I'm here anyway. You might as well use me while you're paying me. Let me already help you select the brightest and best from your end user organization, and let me work with them for this duration of 8, 9, 10 months and get them prepared for working on the project with their IT counterparts. Talk about something that had never been even thought of before, and talk about success on the project. When those people came, they hit the ground running. They were ready. When we went into requirements definition, requirements gathering, they weren't sitting around twiddling thumbs wondering what's going next. They had their process documents, their procedures documents, their policy documents out, and every single requirement that was dealt with had a line from some document that proved that that requirement needed to be in the document. So they were ready. And that was huge in terms of developing, first of all, getting the organization culturally ready for the IT provider. But the IT provider themselves thanked me because they now had a client base that could stand toe to toe with them and not waste a lot of time educating them in the process. So wow. I agree exactly with what you were just talking about.
Getting ahead of things. I hate to say it. The plan is not the thing. You know, you don't drive your car down a map, you drive your car down a freeway. But in the same manner, to plan is the thing. And this is what we don't understand. We're looking at this plan as this holy grail and this document. It's not that. It's the action of planning and consciously integrating that into the way we do our work. You don't protect the plan. You don't protect the schedule. You look at some concepts that actually allow you to control. Now here's where we get really interesting here. I was thinking about this when I was preparing for this. What are the criteria you decide just on a project? And let's abstract it out. Doesn't matter whether the project is 2 weeks and it's internal or it's a $400 million project. What are the criteria you use to make your decisions to look at success and to do that? How do you make those decisions?
I think back to how we started, certainly the traditional ones are always there. Cost, scope, schedule, and quality. They have to be there. But more importantly, and especially that I've worked with a lot of end user client organizations, especially I believe that unless the end user is satisfied, unless they have a product that is usable and that made their lives better than it was before the product appeared on their desktops, then there is no success unless they are satisfied. So I think for me, it's that whole usability, client satisfaction that probably even trumps scope, cost, quality, and timelines.
What I call that is necessary.
Yeah.
Necessary. And I drill this into my students' head. When do I make a change? When necessary. When do I resolve an issue? When do I address a crisis? When necessary. And then we go through, and this is what I do with my teams, and this is what I do with my stakeholders too. Let's have a formal definition of necessary. And necessary is, does it aim the project to what we want, or does it ensure success, or does it minimize failure? Right. And I leave the definition at that level. And that way, each and every stakeholder, each and every team member has their perception of success and failure. And it's my job to make sure that everybody has an equal playing field and talks within this terminology. It's the foundation of the ground rules.
Yeah.
That we all have our different perception of necessary, and we're able to debate in an open way, but the objective is that at the end of the day, we're going to have consensus.
I actually, I actually had some of my IT counterparts say that I went over the dark side when I began to kind of advocate on behalf of the client. And I remember distinctly one time going to the IT provider's project manager and trying to discuss a situation with him that would make the product much better. It was a small scope item, it truly was. But the first words out of this other person's mouths were, man, if I do that, that's going to do this to me. That's going to cause this problem for me. That's going to, I just looked at him and I said, who's the client here?
Who's buying this?
Who are you trying to satisfy? I'm not asking you to do it for free. You already agreed it's better for the client and will give a better product. Let's look at what's possible. Maybe I can talk to the client about de-scoping some functional area that's not as important to them. We can do something, but please don't just say no automatically. And that's, I think I come from that dark side now, from the client side, where I'm really a table pounding, fist bumping advocate on behalf of the client.
Yeah, that's why we're in the room. That's why we have the contract. That's why we have the work.
Yes.
And they're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. They're part of the solution. That's a huge step. I actually differentiate consulting from project management.
Yeah.
Project management creates a deliverable that meets objectives. And consulting solves a problem. And it doesn't matter whether that problem is within scope or outside of scope. You don't do work that doesn't solve a problem as a consultant. You engage directly with them. And I really perceive consulting as more of a relationship than project management is.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And it just, you know, again, this is not just my experience. This is formal consulting training that actually lays this out. This is fascinating for me. The more and more I study this, if it weren't like you said, if it weren't for problems, you know, there'd be no projects. If it weren't for people, projects would be automated.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
we wouldn't even think about it. And it's actually getting ahead and basically making sure that people don't stumble and making sure people are confident in their steps and their decisions that make things smooth, that make projects even greater successes. And that's where a project manager really can add value. It's being prepared. It's walking into a 5-year project where you know you're going to spend 7 to 9 months working with the employees and working with education and awareness and marketing. And it's all these things that where you know you're thinking of things before anybody else does, and you're connecting dots that nobody else does. And this is where we can actually influence a project and make it better.
But just imagine if after several months of what we're doing, we had project managers in our audience who not only became better project managers just from some of the conversations you and I are having, but became consultative project managers, became leaders as project managers. Imagine the power in that kind of a person as they went to deliver the product. Because it's possible.
Well, not only that, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
I don't have the data behind this, but so many of my students were put into management positions and put in to leadership positions, and they were given no training.
Right.
The expectations were set. And so they're making really clumsy decisions, not because it's their fault, through no fault of their own. They're doing the best they can. And so about a third of the classwork that I have is unlearning these habits and behaviors people build. And again, it's not their fault. We have a culture
Yeah.
right now inside business that says, get it done, get it out of the way, throw it over your shoulder and move on. And
Well,
that's exactly opposite what a project manager is here to say.
well, and as you were talking, I was just thinking of all the young project managers who are gifted people, intelligent people, but because they lacked the experience or they lacked, as you said, the mentorship, what they would do is the first thing they do is they'd go to the Gantt chart and they'd look at the schedule and they'd fall back on what the schedule said. And then doesn't matter what's going on, we make the schedule no matter. If you have to work your team's 24 hours and the weekends, we get it done. And that just, at some point when you develop the experience, you get into situations where you don't have to be in those predicaments.
How long does it take to actually learn this? I have numbers for my mentors. I have my experience. How long does it take for you to be comfortable with this level of performance?
I don't know I know it took me a long time. It took me years before I became comfortable. And a lot of that was bouncing off of people, even my clients who were much wiser than I was in terms of steeped in business. I would bounce things off of. In fact, I'll tell you this quick funny story was when I was in Hawaii, one of my very first solo project management experiences. My counterpart on the stateside was an elderly Japanese gentleman named Fred Shimabukuro. And I can use his name now because I respect this man so much. He was quite a bit older than me. And he would see me and see how I would react in situations. And then all he'd go is, Merv, come here, come here. He had this deep, kind of gravelly voice. He would take me into his office, close the door, and his office was kind of this Zen room. It was so quiet. There was water in the background. And then he would go on and proceed to tell me how in their culture what I had said offended someone and how I should respond the next time. I learned more from my client counterpart on that project than probably any 5 other project managers that I've worked with.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an experience and what an opportunity. Let's go ahead and think and consider talking about mentorship and
Yeah.
mentors. I think that would be a really good topic for us to talk about because it took me about 10 or 15 years to actually learn how to be comfortable with this level of decision making and have this much accountability on my shoulders.
Yeah.
And I think it would be great for us to not do a laundry list of our mentors, but do some data points while we talk about how you can find mentors, how you can actually um, look at mentors, and when do you need a mentor and when do you not? I think that we can actually give people a lot of tools and equipment so that they can actually sidestep some of the issues you have early in your project management career.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would relish that. In fact, I would start reading up some of my old experiences just to be able to speak intelligently on particular topics.
Oh, Merv, I've never heard you speak otherwise then. You're always prepared for a good story and a great conversation. This is really enjoyable. So let's go ahead and talk about mentors and mentorship and see what we can do to actually provide a not just an environment of conversation, but maybe some tools and equipment and mindsets that we can actually help people.
Yeah.
And again, everyone, this is not just a conversation for Tim and Merv. This is not just a conversation within an hour. If you want to carry on these conversations, you know how to get hold of each one of us. We have communications and links when we send the links out, but also those of you in our communities, you know how to reach out to us as well. Please do. My door is always open. I talk to about 15 to 25 people every 2 or 3 months on such topics, and I'm not anywhere near wise, but at least I'm good for sanity checking, as well as basically what has worked and what hasn't.
Yeah. And I think that's what it comes down to. What has worked and what hasn't? And what can you learn from our experiences that you don't have to reinvent the wheel and go through the bad ideas yourself? What do
Very,
they say? I stand on the shoulders. No. Yeah, I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me. Is that how it goes?
right. That's exactly right. And I am lucky to stand on the shoulders of those who I do.
That's
And if you find any wisdom in what I talk about, 20% of it is my scars, and the other 80% was me just luckily listening to the people around me.
well, great. So until next time, Tim, a week from today, same time, same channel, we'll pick it up again.
Sounds great. Thanks again for the opportunity, Merv.
Thank you.